Somewhere inside a heavily guarded palace in Riyadh, a deal was made. No press conference announced it. No treaty was signed in public view. No American diplomat was in the room. And yet, in the quiet corridors of that meeting, the financial architecture that has governed the entire global economy for the past 50 years began to crack from the inside. The man who made that decision, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known to the world simply as MBS, did not do it with a declaration of war. He did it with a phone call to Beijing. And what happened next is going to reshape the economic world your children will inherit. Right now, as you watch this video, oil is trading above $100 per barrel. Iranian drones have struck a Qatari liquefied natural gas facility that supplies energy to Europe. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil flows every single day, is being deliberately strangled. The United States military has struck approximately 6,000 targets inside Iran. Quite a lie, hidden beneath the deafening noise of missile strikes and geopolitical chaos, Mohammed bin Salman has been doing something that no Saudi leader has dared to do since 1973. He has been selling oil to China in a currency that is not the US dollar. We are going to take you through every layer of this story. We are going to show you how a 50-year financial agreement, the agreement that made the American dollar the king of the world, is fracturing in real time. We are going to connect the Iran war, the Gulf crisis, the oil shock, and MBS's secret Beijing pivot into a single coherent story that Wall Street does not want you to understand yet. And at the very end of this video, we are going to show you the one revelation that changes everything. Because the real story here is not about bombs. The real story is about who controls the currency that controls the world. Stay with us. Because by the time this video is over, you will never look at your dollar bills the same way again. Let us begin at the very foundation. To understand what MBS is doing today, you have to understand what his father's predecessors agreed to more than 5 decades ago. The year is 1973. The United States has just severed its currency from gold. The Bretton Woods system, the framework that had given the dollar its anchor since the end of World War II, has collapsed under the weight of the Vietnam War's spending. The dollar is suddenly floating free, backed by nothing except the promise of the American government. For many nations, that is simply not enough. The dollar's value is in free fall. America's economic dominance looks genuinely threatened. Then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger does something extraordinary. He flies to Riyadh. He meets with Saudi leadership. And he makes an offer that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia cannot refuse. Here's the deal as history records it. Saudi Arabia will sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. Every barrel, every transaction, every contract. Dollars only. In exchange, the United States will provide Saudi Arabia with military protection, weapon systems, security guarantees, and political backing on the global stage. The deal is sealed in 1974. And what it does to the global economy is nothing short of miraculous for America. Because here is what that arrangement actually means in practice. If you are Japan and you want to buy Saudi oil, you need dollars first. If you're South Korea and you want to buy Saudi oil, you need dollars. If you're France, Germany, Brazil, India, every nation on earth that needs energy, you need US dollars before you can buy it. And that means every central bank on earth must hold enormous reserves of US dollars at all times. And that means demand for the dollar never stops. That means the United States can print money, run deficits, fund wars, and consume far beyond its means. Again, because the world will always need your currency. The petrodollar is not just an oil pricing mechanism. The petrodollar is the engine of American financial supremacy. It is the hidden tax the rest of the world pays every single day just to keep their economies running. For 50 years, that system held. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia was the loyal cornerstone of dollar dominance. But the world was changing. China was rising. And MBS was watching. There is something else you must understand about that 1974 deal before we move forward, because it is essential context for everything MBS is doing today. The petrodollar agreement was not merely economic, it was psychological. It sent a signal to every oil-producing nation on earth that the United States was the indispensable partner for energy wealth. It meant that Arab oil monarchies recycled their enormous petroleum revenues, the so-called petrodollar surpluses, right back into U.S. Treasury bonds, American stocks, American real estate, and American financial instruments. The money left the Middle East in the form of oil payments and came right back as investment capital. America was, in effect, running a brilliantly designed circular economy. It consumed Gulf oil, paid dollars for it, and then attracted those same dollars back into its own financial markets. The Gulf states got security. America got everything else. By some estimates, the petrodollar recycling mechanism has contributed trillions of dollars in investment flows into U.S. markets over the past 5 decades. It helped finance everything from the Reagan defense buildup to the tech boom of the 1990s to the post-2008 economic recovery. The dollar's reserve status, underpinned by the petrodollar, allowed the United States to borrow at interest rates far below what any other country with comparable debt levy else could achieve. This is the privilege that economists call the exorbitant privilege, and it is the privilege that Mohammed bin Salman, in his quiet conversations with Beijing, is now in the process of quietly renegotiating. Now let us fast forward to the present moment, because everything that is happening right now, the Iran war, the Gulf crisis, the energy shock, cannot be understood in isolation. It is all connected to the same underlying tectonic shift. And you will not understand MBS's Beijing deal unless you understand why Iran's missiles started flying in the first place. In the weeks before this conflict escalated to its current level, Iran was watching a very specific set of events. American and Israeli military planners had spent months coordinating strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. When those strikes came, they were unprecedented in scale. The United States military alone struck approximately 6,000 sand targets inside Iran. The stated objectives were threefold: destroy Iran's missile production capacity, permanently halt its nuclear program, and create conditions for what American officials privately described as regime change. Iran's supreme leadership understood immediately that this was not a limited strike. This was an attempt to fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Middle East forever. And here is where the story gets complicated, because Iran had options, and the option it chose reveals everything about how the modern world actually works. Iran's response was not to strike American military bases directly, though it threatened to do so. Iran's first and most calculated strike was against the Gulf states. The Ras Tanura refinery complex in Saudi Arabia, one of the single largest oil processing facilities on Earth, was hit. The Bapco refinery complex in Bahrain was struck, forcing that nation's energy company to declare force majeure on its shipments. 6 electricity transmission lines in Kuwait were knocked out by drone debris. And perhaps most symbolically devastating of all, an Iranian drone struck a facility belonging to Qatar Energy in Ras Laffan, the production hub the world's largest liquefied natural gas operation, the single most important supplier of energy to Europe's winter heating needs. Iran was not trying to win a military war. Iran was trying to destabilize the global energy system, and it was succeeding. Consider what the targeting pattern reveals about Iranian strategic thinking. The Ras Tanura facility in Saudi Arabia processes a staggering portion of Saudi crude before it reaches export terminals. Hitting it does not just disrupt one pipeline or one storage tank. It disrupts the upstream flow for millions of barrels of downstream exports. The Bapco facility in Bahrain. Consider what the targeting pattern reveals about Iranian strategic thinking. The Ras Tanura facility in Saudi Arabia processes a staggering portion of Saudi crude before it reaches export terminals. Hitting it does not just disrupt one pipeline or one storage tank. It disrupts the upstream flow for millions of barrels of downstream exports. The Bapco facility in Bahrain is similarly critical. Bahrain's economy is built around its refining capacity. And when that capacity goes offline and force majeure is declared, entire cargo contracts collapse, buyers scramble for alternative suppliers, and prices spike in real time on the futures markets. Kuwait's electricity grid disruption was perhaps the most psychologically targeted strike of all. It reminded Gulf citizens that their comfortable modern lives, their air conditioning in the desert heat, their desalination plants that provide drinking water, their hospitals and schools and shopping centers, all of it depends on an energy infrastructure that is now suddenly vulnerable. Iranian military planners understood exactly what they were doing. They were not trying to occupy territory. They were not trying to sink American aircraft carriers, though that threat remains very much on the table if the conflict escalates further. They were trying to demonstrate to every government in the Gulf and to every investor and energy buyer in the world that the era of safe, uninterrupted Gulf energy exports is over as long as Iran is under existential military pressure. It was a hostage scenario executed with precision drones instead of masked gunmen. But here is what matters even more. Who was Iran most specifically targeting? And who was Iran deliberately trying to draw into the conflict? The answer to that question is Mohammed bin Salman. And to understand why, you need to understand the betrayal that preceded the bombs. Before the first American strike on Iran, there were phone calls. According to reporting from the Washington Post, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was on the telephone with President Trump, and those calls were not calls of restraint. MBS was actively urging the United States to strike Iran. Think about what that means. The lead of a Sunni Arab kingdom that had spent years carefully rebuilding diplomatic bridges with its Shia Persian neighbor, the kingdom that had signed a China-brokered normalization deal with Tehran in 2023, was now privately lobbying for American military action against Iran. The reconciliation was a facade. The strategic calculations beneath it were something else entirely. Iran knew. Iran always knew. The reconciliation with Saudi Arabia had bought time, but it had never bought trust. And when the bombs started falling on Iranian soil, Tehran's leadership made a decision that was as much a message to Riyadh as it was a military operation. We know what you did. We know who made the calls. And we are going to make sure the world knows that there is no such thing as a neutral Gulf state in this conflict. Iran's strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure were deliberate. They were targeted. And they sent oil prices screaming above $100 per barrel for the first time in years, up more than 38% from pre-conflict levels in a matter of days. The International Monetary Fund immediately issued a warning that every 10% increase in energy prices sustained through 2026 would raise global inflation by nearly half a percentage point. That sounds like an abstract statistic until you realize what it means for Americans. Gasoline prices, heating bills, food costs, everything that gets transported, refrigerated, manufactured, or grown depends on energy. Every family in America is already feeling this war in their wallet. But here is the open loop that we need to hold on to, because this is where the story gets truly extraordinary. While the missiles were flying and the oil prices were spiking, Mohammed bin Salman was simultaneously navigating the most dangerous diplomatic tightrope in the history of Saudi foreign policy. And what he was building in private, the deal with Beijing that we mentioned at the top of this video, was not separate from this crisis. It was a direct response to it. We will get to the full details of what MBS agreed to with China in just a moment. And when we do, you will understand why everything happening in the Gulf right now is not chaotic. It is deeply, deliberately strategic. Now let us talk about the economic earthquake. Because the human drama of this conflict, the airstrikes, the drone attacks, the geopolitical brinkmanship, is almost a distraction from the financial catastrophe unfolding beneath it. And if you are an American over 40 years old, the financial story is the one that matters most to your daily life. The Strait of Hormuz. Let us take a moment to truly understand what this waterway means to the global economy, because most people hear the name and understand it abstractly. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage, at its narrowest point barely 33 kilometers wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the broader world ocean. Through this corridor flows approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply, not to 20% of Middle Eastern oil, 20% of all the oil consumed on Earth every single day. Roughly 21 million barrels pass through that strait daily. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself all depend on the Strait of Hormuz for their oil exports. Iran does not need to close the strait to create a global catastrophe. It only needs to make shipping companies afraid. Iranian forces have a documented history of harassing, boarding, and seizing oil tankers in these waters. When insurance companies raise their premiums for vessels transiting the strait, which they have now done dramatically, shipping companies either pass those costs on to customers or they reroute their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to delivery times and millions in additional costs. Either way, the price of energy goes up. Either way, you pay more. And now, with Iranian mine-laying vessels active in the Gulf waters, the United States military confirmed that more than 30 such vessels were damaged or destroyed in the early days of the conflict. While the threat to global shipping is not theoretical, it is immediate. The Lloyd's of London insurance market has effectively placed the Persian Gulf in its highest risk category, which means that every barrel of oil that successfully transits the strait now costs significantly more to deliver. And that cost flows directly into the price of gasoline at your local pump, the price of groceries at your local store, and the interest rates the Federal Reserve feels compelled to maintain as it battles the resulting inflation. Europe is in an even more acute crisis. The Qatar LNG strike, the attack on Roslafen's liquefied natural gas infrastructure, has sent European gas prices to their highest level in 4 years. Europe spent much of the last several years trying to rebuild its energy security after becoming dangerously dependent on Russian gas. It turned to Qatar as a major alternative supplier. Now that alternative supply is disrupted, European leaders who were already managing a cost of living crisis are now facing the prospect of energy rationing in some member states. The G7. Nations have discussed releasing strategic oil reserves to ease the pressure, but as of this recording, they have not coordinated a joint release, a failure of collective action that has made the price spike even sharper. The stock markets have reacted with predictable violence. Energy sector stocks have surged as oil prices climb. ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, and BP are all posting significant share price gains, but the broader market is deeply unsettled. Defense spending stocks are up, safe haven. Assets, gold especially, which was already above $5,500 per ounce before this conflict escalated, have surged further. And the bond markets are sending a signal that the Federal Reserve is watching very carefully. Inflation expectations are rising again. just as central bankers thought they had finally brought the post-pandemic price surge under control. For ordinary Americans, this is the worst possible timing. Mortgage rates are already elevated. Savings rates, while better than the zero-rate era, are not keeping pace with what inflation could become if oil stays above $100 for an extended period. And the political consequences of a sustained energy shock, with congressional elections on the horizon, are not lost on anyone in Washington. The last time oil sustained a price above $100 for an extended period was the decade between 2003 and 2014. During that era, analysts estimated that American households were effectively paying a hidden oil tax of several $1,000s per year, compared to what they would have paid in a low energy cost environment. That tax, say, in the form of higher gasoline prices, higher airline tickets, higher food costs, higher electricity bills, and higher prices for virtually every manufactured product, since all manufacturing depends on energy for its production and transportation. We are entering a period that may replicate or exceed that tax burden on American families. And this time, unlike the early 2000s commodity boom, the energy shock is raving alongside elevated debt levels, higher baseline inflation, and a Federal Reserve that has far less room to cut interest rates in response without reigniting the inflation it has only recently managed to bring partially under control. There is an asymmetry in how this pain is distributed that deserves attention. Wealthy Americans and large corporations tend to have more tools to hedge against energy price inflation. They can lock in energy contracts. They can invest in energy sector equities that appreciate as oil prices rise, effectively offsetting the increased cost of consuming oil. Working class and middle class Americans, by contrast, have fewer hedges. They cannot easily reduce their gasoline consumption if they depend on a car to get to work. They cannot renegotiate their heating bills. They cannot easily substitute away from food products whose prices are rising because the cost of fertilizer, transportation, and refrigeration has all gone up with oil. The energy shock is, as energy shocks always are, a regressive tax, one that falls most heavily on those least able to absorb it. But all of this, the oil price surge, the energy crisis, the stock market volatility, the inflation threat, all of it is the context within which Mohammed bin Salman is making his most consequential decision. Because here is what most analysts are missing. The war did not create MBS's incentive to pivot toward China. The war simply accelerated a process that had been underway for years. And the nature of that process, the details of what MBS has actually agreed to with Beijing, is the revelation that changes everything about how you understand the global financial system going forward. Let us go back to the beginning of the MBS-Beijing relationships, because this story does not start with the current conflict. It starts in 2022, when Chinese President Xi Jinping made a historic visit to Riyadh. During that visit, Xi presented MBS with a proposal that Western financial analysts largely dismissed as aspirational at the time. The proposal was simple in concept and revolutionary in implication. Saudi Arabia would begin pricing in rather than US dollars. In exchange, China would deepen its investment in Saudi infrastructure, provide technology partnerships for Vision 2030, MBS's ambitious economic diversification plan, and cement the relationship between the world's largest oil exporter and the world's largest oil importer in a way that was completely independent of American financial systems. MBS initially welcomed the idea, but his advisors were cautious. And here's why. Saudi Arabia's currency, the rial, is pegged to the US dollar. Every Saudi bank account, every government revenue calculation, every domestic economic planning model is built around the assumptus. On that, the rial equals a fixed amount of dollars. If Saudi Arabia begins accepting yuan for its oil instead of dollars, and if that yuan cannot be freely converted into dollars at a predictable rate, then Saudi Arabia is taking on enormous financial risk. The peg could come under pressure. The domestic economy could destabilize. MBS's aides reportedly warned him of unpredictable economic damage if he moved ahead with the plan hastily. So the talks continued, quietly, intermittently, away from the headlines. For 6 years, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, Saudi and Chinese officials discussed the mechanics of yuan-denominated oil pricing in varying degrees of seriousness, depending on the state of US-Saudi relations at any given moment. And then something changed. Two things, actually. The first was Russia, when the United States and its allies froze Russia's foreign currency reserves following the invasion of Ukraine, essentially locking hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian assets inside Western financial institutions. Every petrostate on Earth watched and took note. If Washington could freeze Russia's reserves, it could theoretically freeze anyone's reserves. Saudi Arabia holds enormous wealth in U.S. financial institutions. The implications were not lost on Riyadh. Diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets suddenly became not just an economic preference, but a matter of national security. The second thing that changed was the current conflict. When MBS privately lobbied for American strikes on Iran, he was placing a massive geopolitical bet. He was betting that a weakened Iran would be good for Saudi regional dominance, that American military power would eliminate the Persian threat that has shadowed the Gulf states for decades, and that Washington would reward Saudi cooperation with renewed security guarantees, and perhaps even the formal defense treaty that Riyadh has long sought. But wars are messy. Iranian missiles struck Saudi oil infrastructure anyway. The Gulf is now in chaos, and the United States, stretched thin across multiple global commitments, cannot guarantee that it will always be there to intercept every Iranian drone. In that environment, MBS's outreach to Beijing looks less like a betrayal of America and more like a rational hedge by a leader who has concluded that the unipolar American moment is ending, and that the kingdom that survives the coming transition will be the one that positioned itself on multiple sides of the emerging multipolar order. Here is what the MBS-Beijing agreement actually involves, as best as analysts and intelligence assessments can determine. Saudi Arabia has begun settling a portion of its oil exports to China through the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, known as the INE, using yuan-denominated crude oil futures. China launched the INE back in 2018 specifically to create an alternative to the dollar-denominated Brent and West Texas intermediate benchmarks that have dominated global oil pricing for decades. By routing some Saudi oil sales through the INE, MBS is doing something his predecessors would have considered unthinkable. He is creating a parallel pricing mechanism for the world's most strategically vital commodity that operates entirely outside the US dollar system. And there is a detail here that most analysts gloss over, but that is actually critical to understanding the mechanism. When oil is priced and settled in yuan through the INE, China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, has offered an additional sweetener to make the arrangement more attractive to Gulf producers. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf oil exporters can convert their yuan oil revenue into gold through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. This goal, deconversion option, addresses the single biggest concern that Gulf oil producers have about accepting yuan, that the currency may not be freely convertible, or that its value might be manipulated by Beijing. By offering gold conversion as an exit ramp from the yuan, China is effectively saying, trust our currency for the transaction, but if you're not comfortable holding yuan long term, here is hard metal you can keep instead. Saudi Arabia has also joined Project mBridge, a multi-central bank digital currency platform that would allow instant cross-border payments without passing through the SWIFT financial messaging system that the United States and its allies control. Think of SWIFT as the backbone of the global dollar system. It is the network through which virtually all major international financial transactions are routed. When the US sanctions a country, it often does so by cutting that country off from SWIFT, as it did with Russia, Iran, and others. By joining mBridge, Saudi Arabia is helping to build the infrastructure for a parallel financial internet that American sanctions cannot touch. And here is the part that should make every American watching this video pay very close attention. Saudi Arabia is not alone. The UAE is also participating in yuan-denominated oil settlements. Russia has been trading oil in yuan with China since Western sanctions forced Moscow out of the dollar system. Iran, the very country that Iran's missiles are now raining across the Gulf, has been trading in yuan and barter arrangements for years. Venezuela, Egypt, even India, America's supposed strategic partner in Asia, has been experimenting with rupee-denominated oil trades with Russia. The petroyuan is no longer a theoretical concept. It is operational. It is growing. And Mohammed bin Salman's quiet agreement with Beijing has just given it the single most powerful endorsement it has ever received. Now we need to talk about what this means for the United States. Not in abstract geopolitical terms, but in concrete, practical terms that affect your life as an American citizen. The petrodollar system has given the United States an extraordinary privilege for 50 years. Because the world needs dollars to buy oil, the world must hold dollars in reserve. Because the world holds dollars in reserve, there is always demand for U.S. Treasury bonds, the financial instruments through which the American government borrows money. Because there is always demand for Treasury bonds, the United States can borrow at lower interest rates than any other country on earth. And because the United States can borrow cheaply, it can afford to run budget deficits, fund its military, build its infrastructure, and finance its social programs in a way that would be financially impossible for any other nation. If the petrodollar weakens, even partially, even gradually, that extraordinary privilege begins to erode. If less of the world's oil is priced in dollars, then central banks around the world need fewer dollar reserves. If they need fewer dollar reserves, they buy fewer U.S. Treasury bonds. If they buy fewer Treasury bonds, the interest rates that the U.S. government must pay to attract buyers goes up. And if U.S. borrowing costs go up, then either taxes rise, social programs get cut, or the national debt grows even faster than it already is. The ripple effects touch every American household. This is not a hypothetical scenario for some distant future. The Congressional Budget Office has already noted that America's debt service costs are becoming one of the fastest growing line items in the federal budget. If the petrodollar's role declines and Treasury demand softens, that problem accelerates dramatically. Interest rates would need to rise to attract replacement buyers for Treasury bonds, and every percentage point increase in the interest rate the U.S. government pays on its debt translates to hundreds of billions of dollars in additional annual expenditure. That money has to come from somewhere, from higher taxes, from reduced spending on defense or social programs, from even more debt issuance in a vicious spiral, or from the Federal Reserve monetizing the debt by essentially printing money, which produces inflation. The currency question deserves its own extended treatment because it is the piece most directly relevant to what you experience every day as an American. The dollar's strength relative to other currencies is not just an abstract financial metric. It determines the real cost of everything you import. The United States runs a massive trade deficit. It imports far more than it exports. Electronics manufactured in Asia, clothing made in South and Southeast Asia, cars with parts from dozens of countries, pharmaceuticals from Europe and India, food products from across the global supply chain, all of these imports are priced in dollars that are stronger because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. If that reserve status erodes even partially, the dollar weakens against trading partner currencies, and the real cost of those imported goods rises. This is sometimes described as imported inflation, inflation that originates not from domestic monetary policy, but from the changing relative value of the currency used to buy things from abroad. There's also the question of what happens to the enormous pool of dollar-denominated assets held by foreign central banks and sovereign wealth funds if confidence in the dollar's reserve status begins to waver. Approximately $6.5 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds are held by foreign governments. If even a fraction of those holders decide to diversify into alternative assets, yuan bonds, gold, euros, or other currencies, the selling pressure on treasuries would push their prices down and their yields up. Rising treasury yields mean rising. Borrowing costs for everything in the U.S. economy that is benchmarked to treasuries, mortgages, car loans, corporate bonds, small business credit lines. The ripple from a dollar reserve status decline is not isolated to Wall Street. It flows directly to Main Street. There's also the currency question. The U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency means that Americans can buy imported goods, electronics, clothing, cars, food, at prices that would otherwise be much higher. Because the dollar is always in demand, it stays strong. A strong dollar makes imports cheap. If the dollar weakens as its reserve status erodes, the cost of everything imported into the United States rises. This is effectively a hidden tax on every American consumer. A tax that will gradually make itself felt over years, not in a single dramatic moment. And here is the particular cruelty of the timing. This shift is happening exactly when America is most distracted. The United States is militarily engaged against Iran. It is managing NATO, commitments in Europe. It is trying to project power in the Pacific against China. Its political system is deeply polarized. And while all of that noise and conflict dominates the headlines, the quiet revolution in how the world prices oil is proceeding steadily underneath the surface. There is another dimension to this story that we have not yet fully explored, and it concerns the internal crisis inside Iran itself. Because here too, the situation is more complex than it appears. While the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's most powerful military ideological institution, has been conducting strikes against Gulf energy infrastructure. Iran's own elected president, Masoud Pezeshkian, has been sending very different signals. He has publicly apologized to neighboring states for the attacks. He has articulated a set of conditions under which Iran would be willing to negotiate: recognition of Iran's legitimate rights, payment of reparations, and firm international guarantees against future military aggression. But the IRGC is not under Pezeshkian's command. The Revolutionary Guard's answer to the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and their institutional interests are deeply tied to the continuation of the conflict. The IRGC's business empire inside Iran, which controls enormous portions of the Iranian economy, thrives during periods of international isolation and conflict. Peace would be bad for the Guard's budget. And so, even as Iran's elected president calls for negotiation, Iran's military deep state continues the strikes. This is a dangerous situation for multiple reasons. If Pezeshkian cannot control the IRGC, then any ceasefire deal he negotiates is worthless, because the Guards can simply resume operations under a different pretext. If American and Israeli military planners conclude that Iran's leadership is genuinely split, and that there is a negotiating partner in Tehran, they might ease pressure at exactly the moment when that pressure is most effective. And if the conflict drags on indefinitely, Without resolution, the sustained damage to Gulf energy infrastructure and global oil markets will eventually trigger a global recession, which is in nobody's interest except perhaps those who benefit from the chaos. China is watching this dynamic very carefully. Beijing does not want a wider regional war that could disrupt its own energy supplies. China imports more than 70% of the oil it needs, and a significant portion of that comes from the Gulf. But China also recognizes that. Let us also take a moment to examine what China's strategic interests actually are in this crisis, because Beijing's role is frequently misunderstood by Western commentators. China is not cheering for Iran's military campaign. China imports substantial amounts of energy from the Gulf, and anything that disrupts Gulf energy flows raises China's own costs. China also has significant investment, TS, in UAE infrastructure, Saudi industrial projects, and Gulf sovereign wealth funds that are diversifying into Chinese assets. A regional war that spirals out of control is not good for any of those interests. What China is doing is something more sophisticated than simply rooting for American defeat. China is positioning itself as the indispensable mediator of the post-conflict order, just as China brokered the Saudi-Iran normalization deal in 2023, which turned out to be fragile, but was nevertheless a remarkable diplomatic achievement that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Beijing is signaling that it is the power capable of managing relationships across the Gulf's traditional divides. It talks to Iran, it talks to Saudi Arabia, it talks to the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait. It has no regional military footprint that creates the resentments and dependencies that America's presence generates. And it is willing to use its economic weight. The fact that it is the largest or second largest trading partner of virtually every country in the Middle East as a source of diplomatic leverage. This is a fundamentally different model of great power engagement from the American model. The United States projects power through military presence, treaty alliances, and financial system control. China projects power through economic interdependence, infrastructure investment, and the patient accumulation of and density relationships that it can activate when needed. Neither model is purely benign. China's infrastructure investments through the Belt and Road Initiative have left some developing nations with unsustainable debt and strategic assets controlled by Chinese state entities. But the model is effective. And in the Middle East, where American military engagements have generated as much resentment as gratitude, China's transactional, non-judgmental approach has real appeal. MBS understands this. He has watched China's rise for his entire adult life. He has seen how China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty through a combination of state-directed investment and integration into global trade networks. He wants something analogous for Saudi Arabia through Vision 2030, the economic diversification plan that seeks to reduce the kingdom's dependence on oil revenue by developing new industries, technology sectors, to tourism and entertainment. And China, with its manufacturing expertise, its willingness to transfer technology, and its enormous domestic market, is a more willing partner for that vision than a United States whose political class periodically threatens to sanction Saudi Arabia over human rights concerns. There's a profound irony embedded in the current moment. The United States spent enormous political capital and military resources trying to reshape the Middle East after 2001, with results that are difficult to characterize as successful. Democracy did not take root. Stable governance did not emerge. The region is arguably more volatile now than it was before the first American soldier crossed into Afghanistan. And the one thing that American engagement in the Middle East was supposed to permanently guarantee, the security of energy flows and the stability of the petrodollar system, is now under challenge from a geopolitical competitor that achieved its current influence not through military intervention, but through patient economic statecraft, infrastructure investment, and the simple recognition that money talks in ways that bombs cannot. Let us also address the question that some of you are certainly asking. Is the petrodollar system truly dying, or are we watching a temporary disruption that the United States will eventually manage its way through? The honest answer is that we are witnessing a gradual transformation rather than a sudden collapse. The dollar is not going to disappear as the world's reserve currency next year or even next decade. The American financial system is still the deepest, most liquid, most trusted in the world. The U.S. Treasury market remains the safest parking place for sovereign wealth because no other market can absorb the same volume of institutional money without moving dramatically. And the yuan has serious structural problems as a reserve currency. China's capital controls limit its convertibility, its financial markets are relatively opaque, and its political system does not offer the same rule of law guarantees that investors expect from reserve currency issuers. But the trajectory matters as much as the current position. Every new yuan-denominated oil contract is a data point. Every central bank that diversifies its reserves into yuan, gold, or other non-dollar assets is a data point. Every country that joins Bridge or accepts yuan in trade settlement is a data point. And the direction of all those data points is consistent. Dollar's share of global reserves has been declining for years, from approximately 71% in 1999 to somewhere in the high 50% range today, depending on how you measure. That is a significant structural shift that has occurred gradually, quietly, and largely beneath the awareness of most American voters and media consumers. What MBS is doing now is not single-handedly destroying the petrodollar. What MBS is doing is removing what analysts call the floor of the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia was not just one oil exporter among many in the 1994 agreement. Saudi Arabia was the cornerstone, the anchor, the irreplaceable participant whose loyalty made the entire architecture possible. Every other nation's decision to price oil in dollars was ultimately downstream from Saudi Arabia's decision. If Saudi Arabia fractures that pricing convention, even partially, even incrementally, the psychological and structural effect on the system is disproportionate to the volume of transactions involved. Other Gulf states are watching. The UAE has already been experimenting with yuan settlements. Iraq is conducting some oil transactions in yuan. If the Gulf Cooperation Council countries collectively start routinely accepting yuan for a meaningful portion of their oil sales, the petrodollar's role changes from a universal standard to one option among several. And once it is one option among several, the compounding advantages it gives to the United States begin to diminish. There is one final piece of this puzzle that brings everything together, and it is the piece that MBS understands perhaps more clearly than any other leader in the Gulf. It is the question of what replaces the petrodollar framework. Not just the currency question, but the security architecture that underlies it. The original petrodollar deal was not just about currency. It was a security arrangement. The United States guaranteed Saudi Arabia's defense in exchange for oil pricing in dollars. The American Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, the prepositioned military equipment, the weapons sales, the intelligence cooperation, all of it was the security umbrella that made the financial arrangement possible and enduring. For Saudi Arabia to truly move away from the petrodollar system, it would need to replace that security umbrella with something else. And that something else is the question that keeps analysts in Washington up at night. China cannot currently project military power into the Gulf at the scale the United States can. The People's Liberation Army Navy is growing rapidly, but it does not yet have the carrier groups, the logistics infrastructure, or the basing agreements needed to genuinely substitute for American military power in the region. So MBS is navigating an extraordinary contradiction. He wants Beijing's money and economic partnership without abandoning Washington's military protection. He is trying to have it both ways. And in the short term, the chaos of the current conflict, Iranian missiles threatening Gulf infrastructure, actually makes him more dependent on American military power, not less. But here is what MBS's calculation, as best as we can understand it from his actions rather than his words. The current crisis will eventually end. It always does. And when it ends, the geopolitical landscape will be permanently altered. The relationship between Washington and Tehran will be changed. The relationship between the Gulf states and Iran will be changed. And most importantly, the confidence of Gulf leaders and the reliability of American security guarantees will be changed, not necessarily destroyed, but permanently qualified. MBS has watched the United States remove Houthis from terrorism lists, reverse commitments to Gulf partners, and make foreign policy lurches that seem to ignore Riyadh's security interests. He has concluded that long-term dependence on a single patron, even the world's most powerful military, is a vulnerability, not a strength. Commitments to Gulf partners make foreign policy lurches that seem to ignore Riyadh's security interests. He has concluded that long-term dependence on a single patron, even the world's most powerful military, is a vulnerability, not a strength. Beijing offers a different kind of partnership. China does not tell MBS how to govern his kingdom. China does not issue statements about human rights or democracy. China does not threaten to revise T-arms sales because of domestic political pressure from its legislature. China offers consistent, transactional, non-judgmental partnership, economic investment, technology transfer, and a growing financial architecture that does not run through Washington. For a leader who values sovereign decision-making above almost everything else, that is an extremely attractive offer. And that is why what MBS has built with Beijing is not simply a currency deal. It is the foundation of an alternative world order, or at least an alternative Gulf order, in which the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is not a client state of the United States, but a pivot power that sits at the intersection of the old world and the new, extracting maximum value from both relationships while genuinely depending on neither. The implications for every American watching this video are profound and personal. The energy shock from the current conflict is temporary, painful but temporary. Oil prices will eventually stabilize. The Strait of Hormuz, however disrupted, will eventually normalize. What is not temporary is the structural shift in how the world prices the commodity that powers everything. If you own a home, the value of that home is ultimately connected to the stability of the dollar. If you have savings, those savings are denominated in dollars whose purchasing power is downstream from the dollar's reserve status. If you receive Social Security or a pension, those benefits are funded by a government whose borrowing costs depend on global demand for treasury bonds, which depends on global demand for dollars, which depends substantially on the petrodollar system. This is not a crisis that will explode in a single moment. It is a slow redistribution of financial power from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the West to an emerging multipolar order that will unfold over years and decades. But the current conflict has accelerated its timeline. The strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, the oil price spike, the scramble for energy security in Europe, and most importantly, MBS's accelerating pivot toward Beijing. All of these are compressed into a period of weeks and months when in a more stable world they might have unfolded over years. What can ordinary Americans do with this information? The first thing you can do is understand it. The petrodollar is not taught in schools. The mechanism by which dollar dominance subsidizes American living standards is not explored. Aimed in mainstream financial media, the nightly news will show you the explosions. It will show you the humanitarian consequences of the Gulf crisis. It will show you the politicians debating about what America should do militarily. What it almost certainly will not show you is the quiet revolution in oil pricing that is happening simultaneously and that has more long-term significance for your family's financial life than any individual military development. But you are watching this video, which means you are the kind of person who seeks out the analysis that goes below the surface. Understanding what is happening is the prerequisite for every intelligent decision that follows. Investment decisions, savings decisions, decisions about what assets to hold and in what form. The second thing is to watch the indicators. The oil price, the dollar index, which measures the dollar's strength against a basket of major currencies, gold prices, which historically move inversely to confidence in fiat currencies, the pace of central bank gold buying globally, which has been at or near record levels in recent years, the share of global trade settled in yuan versus dollars, the volume of transactions clearing through the Shanghai INE versus through traditional dollar-denominated benchmarks. These are the real-time readouts of the transformation we are describing. You do not need to be a financial professional to follow these numbers. They are publicly available, they are updated daily, and they will tell you more about the state of the global financial transition than any politician's speech or central banker's press conference. And the third thing is to watch Mohammed bin Salman. Not because he is the most important actor in this drama, he is not. The United States, China, and Iran are the great powers whose decisions will ultimately determine how this transitions. But MBS is the swing variable. He is the leader who sits at the hinge of history, who could accelerate or decelerate the petrodollar's decline depending on the choices he makes in the coming months. His hidden agreement with Beijing is not yet reversible. It could still be walked back if Washington offers the right combination of security guarantees, economic incentives, and political respect. But the window for that kind of course correction is narrow, and it is narrowing fast. Every week that passes without a yes-arious American strategic offer to Riyadh is a week in which China consolidates its position as MBS's preferred long-term economic partner. Every barrel of oil settled in yuan rather than dollars makes the alternative architecture more normalized, more embedded, and more difficult to reverse. The compound interest of geopolitical momentum works exactly the same way as financial compound interest. It starts slowly, it accelerates, and by the time most observers notice the magnitude of the shift, the critical inflection point has already passed. The bombs falling on Iran and the drones striking Gulf refineries are the visible, dramatic surface of this story. They will fill the front pages and dominate the broadcast news. But beneath that surface, in the meetings between Saudi financial ministers and Chinese energy executives, in the settlement systems being quietly expanded on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange, in the Enbridge digital currency infrastructure being built transaction by transaction, the geography of global financial power is being redrawn. 50 years ago, Henry Kissinger flew to Riyadh and made a deal that shaped the economic world you were born into. Today, in the shadow of a war that has lit the Middle East on fire, Mohammed bin Salman is flying, metaphorically and sometimes literally, to Beijing. And the deal he is making there will shape the economic world your children inherit. The petrodollar is not dead. But for the first time in half a century, it is genuinely, structurally threatened by a Saudi leader willing to bet that the future belongs to Beijing as much as T belongs to Washington. And that is the most consequential geopolitical development of our era, more consequential in the long run than any single missile strike or drone attack. If you have made it this far in this video, you already understand more about the real mechanics of global power than the overwhelming majority of Americans. The financial press will catch up to this story eventually. The mainstream news will connect these dots eventually, but by the time they do, the moment will already have passed, the positions will already have been taken, the frameworks will already have shifted, the new architecture will already be in place. This is your early warning. The geography of the petrodollar is changing. MBS has made his bet. Beijing is collecting. And the question that history will ask of this generation of Americans is not whether they watched the bombs fall, but whether they understood what was happening to their currency while the world was distracted by the explosions. This is a story we will continue to track on this channel as it develops. The Iran conflict, the Gulf energy crisis, the Saudi pivot to Beijing, and the future of the dollar, these threads are all connected, and they are all moving fast. Every week brings new data, new developments, new signals from Riyadh and Beijing and Tehran and Washington about which direction the current is flowing. If you want to stay ahead of the story, if you want to understand these developments before they become mainstream news, if you want to be among the people who see the shape of the emerging world clearly rather than being surprised by it when it arrives, make sure you are subscribed, because what comes next in the following weeks and months may be even more consequential than what we have described today. The world is being reorganized. The geography of financial power is being redrawn, and the reorganization has only just begun.